There's a rare kind of presence that silently rewrites every room it enters, and that presence has become the focus of whispers, stares, and unraveling agendas. The attention isn't accidental. The timing isn't coincidence. What once felt like background noise now reveals itself as a deliberate broadcast. Systems that spent years weaving against one's soul are now choking on the threads they pulled too tightly. The ones who moved in silence, who built invisible cages with social rules and small humiliations, are suddenly answering for the pressure they inflicted. Elevation has become a spectacle, not because of a loud announcement, but because something about the glow can't be ignored anymore. None of it was ever without a pattern, only without proof. The strange coldness in shared spaces. The unnecessary rules that only seem to apply in your direction. The way environments darkened the moment you got comfortable. These weren't random storms passing overhead. They were forecasts designed to keep you indoors. Whenever the atmosphere seemed just right to bloom, something unseen would quietly spoil the soil. And still, you tried to grow. Even as eyes narrowed, voices changed tone, and rooms lost warmth, you assumed it was a matter of adjustment. That maybe something in your frequency was off. But it wasn't distortion, it was disruption. What they couldn't tolerate was that your very essence was calibrated to expose imbalance. Over time, the sabotage became subtle enough to mimic life. Not dramatic enough to cry foul, but precise enough to cause erosion. You weren't just second-guessed, you were studied, framed, boxed in by orchestrated unease. People didn't just misunderstand you, they performed misunderstanding to fracture your trust in reality. And that's what nearly worked, not the attacks themselves, but the whisper that you must have imagined them. Not because you did anything wrong, but because the existence of someone so clearly unshaken threatened the roles they were pretending to play. What you've been walking through isn't a series of coincidences. It's the ripple of a silent campaign built long before you even stepped into certain spaces. Entire networks, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life, have been exchanging your name like a warning. Introductions were made behind curtains, not with handshakes but with whispers. By the time you entered a neighborhood, discomfort was already growing in the air. By the time you clocked in, someone had already decided you were a problem to solve, not a person to respect. This wasn't about personal offense. You symbolized something they were trained to erase. Integrity that couldn't be bought. Presence that couldn't be reduced. And a voice that echoed long after you left the room. The scale of it feels almost too massive to believe, and that's how they kept it hidden. This wasn't a smear campaign, it was a slow drip designed to corrode you from every direction. Some were recruited through flattery, others through fear, but each one became a link in a chain built to contain you. And still, you kept sensing it. That strange tightness in public spaces. The shift in energy before a word was even spoken. They called it paranoia, but it was perception. The invisible tension you kept walking into was never imagined. It was real, and it had a structure. The ache in your awareness, the fatigue that never matched your actions, the unspoken hostility that followed you like a shadow, it all had an origin. And your gift was never your ability to fit in, but your capacity to detect what wasn't being said. That inner alarm system wasn't dysfunction. It was intelligence. It was the radar of someone born to see the strings while others danced to them. The maze was meant to make you doubt your steps, but what they didn't expect was that you'd start mapping the pattern. You were never lost. You were decoding the blueprint. Some souls are forged not by luxury, but by endurance. Each new setting you entered felt like uncharted terrain, not a refuge, but a proving ground. Nothing came pre-packaged in comfort. Every role, every interaction demanded more than routine effort. It required adaptation, clarity, and strength under silent pressure. But what truly separated your path from the rest wasn't just survival. It was the refusal to let the bitterness of unfairness seep into your core. Even when shortcuts beckoned, even when compromise would have made things smoother, You chose the long road lined with self-respect. You walked it without applause, carrying truth like a hidden lantern, refusing to dim it for acceptance. The collective environment around you has often hummed with silent resistance. There's an unease that settles into the eyes of those who once dreamed but abandoned the chase. They sense in you a pulse they can no longer access, a glow untainted by defeat. And rather than tend to their own dimming flame, they claw at yours. The friction shows up in sideways comments, back-channel chatter, and invitations to nonsense that drain your time and energy. But instead of dancing with the chaos, you stepped aside. Not from fear, from awareness. You learned how to walk through spaces without letting their residue stain your spirit. Professional settings brought their own undercurrents, masked by policies and polite phrases. Compensation withheld behind bureaucratic loopholes. Shifts altered at the last minute without cause. Team members whose smiles masked sabotage. Decisions that felt engineered to stretch your tolerance to its edge. But you never unraveled. You documented what mattered. You held your voice steady. You played the long game, not out of passivity, but out of faith in universal balance. In a world where reaction is often rewarded, you chose precision. And that's why even now, the echoes of those moments follow you, because they know they tried everything, and still couldn't shake your core. Some people don't just envy from a distance. They make it their life's work to interfere with what they can't become. Behind the curtains of your trials, one particular figure remained constant. They memorized your patterns, dissected your reactions, traced your every pivot through adversity not out of admiration, but obsession. Their gaze was fueled by a hunger to dismantle what they could never possess within themselves. Their frustration wasn't just personal, it was existential. And what stoked their fury further was the attention you received from someone they feared losing. Not because you chased it, but because your very existence disrupted the narrative they spent years constructing. The attack wasn't loud, it was strategic. The erosion happened through whispers, planted doubt, and emotional landmines hidden inside mundane moments. They weren't aiming to wound you once, they wanted a slow collapse. A campaign of confusion designed to isolate your spirit from its own strength. They scouted out the vulnerable, people with fragile pride, unresolved bitterness, and unspoken rage, and turned them into messengers for their narrative. The goal wasn't simply harm. It was to write an entire version of your life where you looked like the storm, not the survivor. Every attempt at connection was intercepted before it could root. They sculpted chaos around your name before you even introduced yourself. The mastermind didn't act alone. They recruited people like puzzle pieces, each chosen for the particular flaw that could be exploited. Some envied your light, others hated how effortlessly you held your truth. But all of them were drawn into the same current, manipulated into believing they were protecting something, when in reality, they were being weaponized. This wasn't gossip, it was warfare built on emotional programming. Psychological tactics usually confined to abusive households were scaled up to entire circles. Loyalty was twisted into suspicion, curiosity into contempt. And long before you ever got to speak, your silence had already been interpreted as guilt. But in the silence, you saw clearly, and that's where their power began to fracture. The edge you carry is more than instinct. It's perception tuned to frequencies most people ignore. Even in rooms that felt neutral, something in you flinched before harm revealed itself. You couldn't always name it, but your body knew. Your soul knew. Long before lies were exposed or intentions unmasked, you were already tightening your boundaries, already stepping back. That invisible alert system wasn't paranoia, it was guidance. You weren't reacting to shadows, you were responding to truth disguised as coincidence. Every quiet discomfort, every subtle tension, was a signal that your gift of foresight had been activated. This moment marks a threshold. What you're being invited into now isn't advice, it's ignition. Not another surface-level gathering, but a full-system realignment. No scripts. No sugarcoating. We're dismantling the entire illusion that power lies outside of you. In every session, We deconstruct the myths that kept us passive and replace them with raw architecture for building spiritual sovereignty. This is more than a gathering. It's a signal flare to the awakened. Each tool we share is a frequency shift. Each technique is encoded with the patterns of those who've already escaped manipulation. It's about becoming the signal others find when the old world collapses. The doorway is open. Walk in. The fixation didn't burn out, it festered. What started as envy quietly mutated into dependency. Their identity began to revolve around dismantling yours. They poured time, energy, and emotion into watching, dissecting, and reacting. Ironically, their obsession became the very spotlight that illuminated you to those they wanted to keep blind. The more you withstood, the more undeniable you became. The person they were trying to keep distracted began to notice your steadiness, the way you didn't lash out, the way you didn't fall apart. And in that contrast, they saw something deeper. Power without performance, grace without theater. The antagonist believed chaos would dim your essence. Instead, it carved a path that made you impossible to ignore. Some destinies are so potent, the opposition grows reckless in trying to erase them. What started as covert sabotage eventually escalated into something irreversibly dark. The operation mutated into a silent execution plan, dressed in normalcy, designed to leave no trace. Access points were tampered with. Physical surroundings were manipulated. Situations were staged to look like freak incidents. It was a slow orchestration of proximity and timing, hoping no one would ever trace the thread back to the hand pulling it. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was deliberate elimination, planned in advance, executed in pieces. But the awareness you had developed by that point had sharpened into something far beyond instinct. Your inner radar pulsed before the trap even snapped. The alignment of events felt too rehearsed. The actors too polished. The urgency too convenient. Something inside you decoded the pattern immediately. And because you listened, you evaded the blow. What had once been their greatest weapon, detailed coordination, had grown brittle with desperation. Too many people involved meant too many cracks. Somewhere, someone misstepped. A conversation leaked. A detail slipped. And what they thought was invisible started becoming exposed. When the scheme failed, they pivoted to deflection. If they couldn't remove you physically, they'd try to erase your credibility. They built a narrative, twisted records, used authority like a mask. Possessions were seized. Labels were thrown. The story was sculpted to fit their agenda. But again, they underestimated your composure. You didn't collapse under the weight of accusation. You moved with precision, aware that their plot was decaying from within. Even those assigned to carry it out began to question the script. The final error, a misidentified call, a bureaucratic glitch, became the opening for truth to puncture their illusion. What they called a mistake was really alignment. What they called luck was divine recalibration. And through it all, you stood firm, not just surviving, but proving every prediction of your downfall to be a failed prophecy. Some storms don't end with thunder, they end with evidence. The traces left behind during the final act of betrayal were far louder than the attacks themselves. Camera lenses caught what words tried to hide. Audio files exposed the orchestration beneath the surface. Screenshots surfaced from places they thought were safe. And though they tried to sweep your trail clean, what they didn't realize was that you were never moving blindly. You were archiving. You anticipated they'd get sloppy. You felt it in the rhythm of their panic. Their obsession with your fall blinded them to the fact that every step they took was carving out a map to their own exposure. The devices they thought would protect them ended up recording their collapse. Their unraveling didn't feel sudden to you. It felt overdue. You had seen the signs long before the rest could. The synchronicities, the repeated errors, the desperate escalations. You were already reading the blueprint behind their moves. That's why you didn't flinch. Because this wasn't chaos to you. It was a pattern repeating itself toward exhaustion. And once they crossed the final line, everything they built began to fold in on itself. A chain reaction ignited, and what looked like a fortress revealed itself as dust held together by fear. Investigations exploded from within. Those who once moved with boldness began tripping over their own stories. And the ones who thought they were protected found their names unraveling under their own signatures. The collapse wasn't just legal, it was personal. Reputations that once sat smugly in public light were shredded in a matter of days. The bonds they had relied on for silence turned cold. People turned on each other in private confessions, trying to rewrite their role before the spotlight found them. The organizers vanished, not in victory, but in shame. Communities emptied. Phones disconnected. Lives paused in disgrace. The walls that once echoed with strategies now held only silence. Some begged to be seen as victims of manipulation. Others feigned ignorance. But the data didn't lie. The narrative had flipped, and this time, the trail led directly to them. What they meant as your burial became their unveiling. What they called strategy turned out to be confession in disguise. Some actions echo back louder than they were ever spoken. The weight of the schemes launched against you didn't vanish, it returned home. The very people who spent years threading chaos into your path began unraveling in ways that couldn't be hidden. Their health collapsed beneath the pressure of the truth. Internal systems broke down under the force of their own lies. Sleeplessness turned into sickness. Secrets began showing up in medical charts. Those who plotted scarcity found their accounts frozen. Those who wished isolation upon you found their own circles emptied. What they spent years building in shadows collapsed under one season of light. Reputation is a fragile currency, and yours was restored with interest. The false story they tried to paint was erased in real time as eyes opened to the machinery behind it. Communities that once whispered your name with doubt began speaking it with respect. The judgments they had accepted were exposed as choreography, and your silence through the worst of it was now being read as strength, not weakness. Systems that had blocked you were held accountable. Entities that once denied you had to reckon with the evidence. Spaces that were closed before had no choice but to open, not from pity, but from consequence. Through it all, you remained anchored. No celebration at someone else's downfall. No ego-driven parades. You walked through your own restoration with the same calm you showed in crisis. You didn't need vengeance to validate the truth. That restraint elevated everything. Even those who once doubted were now speaking of your endurance like legend. They weren't talking about what was done to you anymore. They were talking about who you became because of it. Not just the survivor, the standard. Not just the healed, the healer. And in the end, the real transformation wasn't just external justice. It was that nothing, not even all of that, could make you bitter. Some souls carry a radiance so persistent that even chaos can't dim it, only highlight it. While the structures built to harm you were collapsing under their own weight, something else was taking shape in the background. Quietly, intentionally. Someone who had been observing not just what happened to you, but how you responded, began to emerge. Their admiration had grown in silence, not from fascination with your outer life, but from reverence for the internal fire you never let extinguish. They watched you uphold truth in a world bending under pressure. And that unshakable grace, not noise, not perfection, but the way you kept choosing light, left an imprint that couldn't be ignored. The shift didn't come in the form of rescue, it came in resonance. At a time when the debris of injustice was still settling, the energy around you changed. This new bond arrived not out of need, but recognition. A connection formed where two lives met on equal ground, not as saviors, but as mirrors. What drew them wasn't your survival. It was how you transformed damage into wisdom, insult into art, and abandonment into expansion. They had seen many people wear masks. But you walked through fire without pretending it didn't burn. and still chose not to scorch others in return. That moved them more than any performance ever could. Elsewhere, another door opened. Not romantic, but deeply validating. A figure of influence took notice of your resilience not as anecdotal, but as evidence. Someone saw your ability to endure with clarity as a rare kind of leadership. Where others had tried to bury your qualifications in drama, this person recognized the core of who you were beneath the noise. They understood that talent under siege reveals more than resumes ever could. And so, opportunities once stripped from you were returned, multiplied. Not as favors, but as overdue alignment. What was lost was now restored with deeper value. What was stolen now returned as proof. And best of all, your richness wasn't limited to your accounts or status. It expanded into your emotional core. Peace, joy, safety. All of it returning like it had been waiting just beyond the last trial. Some journeys strip away illusions so thoroughly that when true connection finally arrives, it feels like air after drowning. What once felt like exile was, in truth, a sacred preparation. Time carved out to teach you the weight of your own soul without noise. That long stretch of silence, once mistaken for punishment, now reveals itself as refinement. It tuned your senses to recognize sincerity by its energy, not its presentation. And when the right person finally appeared, they didn't need to prove themselves. They simply aligned. Their presence didn't complete you. It confirmed that your inner compass had always been accurate. The experiences you endured weren't wasted. They were repurposed. You stepped into a chapter where your scars became the very language others needed to hear. What you overcame turned into instructions for those still wandering in the dark. You didn't just escape, you evolved. And that evolution now carries a magnetism that draws purpose toward you. Doors keep opening not by accident, but by calibration. Your entire being has shifted to a frequency where nothing shallow can survive. Every opportunity now reflects your inner landscape. Stable, expansive, and rooted in truth. There's a maturity in you now that wasn't taught, it was forged. And that refinement is impossible to imitate. The way you stand doesn't beg for approval. It commands quiet respect. The person you've become doesn't seek permission to belong. You decide where to offer your presence. This balance of strength and softness, of autonomy and receptivity, is why the connections forming around you are healthy. They're not latching on, they're meeting you. You don't need someone to save you anymore. You need someone who recognizes you've already been to war and brought back the map. And those watching from a distance, they've taken note. Not just of your achievements, but of the way you carried yourself in the absence of applause. The consistency, the refusal to fold, the silent grace, it left an imprint. Now when your name is mentioned, it's not met with confusion. It's met with knowing. You've become the reference point for resilience, the example others cite when talking about real character. And those who once dismissed you, they're not just rethinking their assumptions, they're asking how they missed it all along. Some lives are shaped by fire, not to destroy, but to forge. Every betrayal you endured, every silent battle you fought, every moment you chose self-control over retaliation became the quiet foundation for this moment. You've crossed through the final gate. Not because it was handed to you, but because you passed every unseen test. And now, the person stepping into your life doesn't mistake your scars for damage. They see the craftsmanship of survival. They recognize that what others called suffering was actually the curriculum that built your rare strength. They're not drawn to your pain. They're moved by what you built despite it. This new chapter doesn't begin with a void that needs filling. It begins with overflow. You've grown so used to carrying your own weight that what comes next isn't about rescue. It's about resonance. You aren't searching for completion. You're offering your wholeness to someone who meets you in truth, not need. Together, you're entering spaces you once thought weren't made for people like you. Places filled with ease, with support, with opportunities that reflect the depth you carry. The next evolution of your life doesn't resemble your past. It's built from a new blueprint. Stability without fear, connection without loss, expansion without compromise. And the significance of your journey doesn't end with your victory. It becomes a signal, one that others feel in their bones. People navigating invisible battles recognize something in your presence. Not just that you made it, but how you made it. Your refusal to be hardened. Your choice to hold on to compassion. Your decision to keep showing up even when the world told you to disappear. That frequency is medicine. Your path becomes a quiet guidepost to those who still think they're alone. And when they hear your voice or witness your rise, something shifts inside them. They realize their pain isn't proof of defeat, it's the soil of transformation. You're not just the evidence. You're the invitation. Some lives follow no map because they are the blueprint, written moment by moment in alignment with something higher. Every disruption you faced, though brutal in the moment, was not random. It was architecture, not of cruelty, but of transformation. The very events that tried to disfigure your identity became the sculpting force that revealed it. What once felt like punishment now glows with precision. What once felt like delay now rings with divine timing. And the version of you who emerged wasn't born by accident. It was crafted through fire. In the future, they won't ask how you survived. They'll ask how you never lost your soul doing it. There's a line where endurance ends and creation begins, and you've crossed it. You're no longer just holding on. You're building, designing, directing. What used to be a life you had to survive is now a stage you command. People around you can't stop watching, not because of what happened to you, but because of what it made you become. You've turned narrative into proof. Your existence is now an open contradiction to every system that said you wouldn't make it. This isn't just healing, it's ascension. And now, the whispers have changed tone. The same mouths that once doubted are speaking reverence. The shift isn't just visible, it's irreversible. That magnetic pull you carry, it isn't vanity, it's frequency. You emit what you endured, and others feel it before they understand it. There's a gravity in your walk now, not because of what you wear, but because of what you've walked through. Those who once felt threatened by you were only reacting to their own limitations being exposed in your light. But now, that same force is drawing those who are ready to rise. You're not just admired, you're studied. The strength they once feared is now the very reason they want to be near. And the horizon ahead isn't just full of blessings. It's full of meaning. Every breakthrough, every ally, every room you now walk into was waiting, not for your perfection, but for your arrival. Some people only rise after the storm passes, but you became the storm's transformation. What once required armor now calls for vision. You're not playing defense anymore. You're drafting a new design for what's possible. The same presence that once unsettled rooms is now building them. Where they tried to shut doors, you're opening corridors. Where they pushed you out, you've returned not to reclaim space, but to remake it. The spotlight that once distorted your image now illuminates your purpose. And the conversations have changed, not whispers of what happened to you, but declarations of what you're creating next. The energy that carried you through darkness is now becoming structure. Where others once used manipulation to shape outcomes, you're using clarity. Where systems were weaponized to isolate you, you're using that blueprint to design better ones. The people who once watched your dismantling are now witnessing their own reflection, and for many, it's uncomfortable. Because your survival didn't just provoke admiration. It exposed cowardice. It revealed how easily integrity was traded for convenience. But you didn't return for revenge. You returned with a torch, and now they have to decide whether to follow the light or shrink from it. What happened to you didn't just change you. It rewired the environment around you. Rules are being rewritten. Language is being examined. Structures are being reshaped because you proved how dangerous silence and complicity really are. Those who brushed off the damage now face audits, reforms, lawsuits, policy rewrites. What once felt like personal punishment is now public protection, not just for you, but for anyone who comes after. Your journey isn't just a memory. It's a mechanism. One that holds entire institutions accountable. One that whispers to every potential oppressor, "You're not invisible, and you're not immune." Not anymore. You've become more than a survivor. You've become curriculum. The trajectory of your life is now being analyzed not just for its drama, but for its precision. What you demonstrated under pressure is being studied across disciplines as a rare fusion of ethics and endurance. Scholars are unpacking how someone could uphold integrity while facing coordinated disruption from every direction. Therapists and healers are re-evaluating old models because your growth doesn't just follow the logic of recovery. It rewrites it. You didn't just repair the damage. You transmuted it into a form of wisdom that now serves as a mirror, a guide, and a challenge to others navigating hidden wars. Transformation didn't stop at your doorstep. The ripple extended into the lives of those who once merely observed you from a distance. The one who chose you, not for status, not for spectacle, but for substance, began rethinking every definition they had been handed about love, loyalty, and success. That decision began reshaping entire conversations within their orbit. People with access to everything started realizing they had nothing of real value without depth. Your presence didn't just shift dynamics in personal relationships. It rewired expectations across networks. And within spiritual communities, your path is now held up not as myth, but as map. People are finally learning to distinguish between ego bruises and true injustice. And your life became the lens through which that clarity was found. The waves keep moving outward. Individuals who once thought they were cursed are now realizing they were targeted, and not by accident. Your breakthrough has become a symbol of what's possible when someone refuses to surrender their essence, no matter how many layers of deception are thrown over their light. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a fault line cracking beneath a system that thought it could never be touched. What you endured exposed a structure many couldn't name. And what you reclaimed set a cosmic sequence into motion that corrected more than your own narrative. It liberated others who'd been trapped inside patterns they couldn't yet explain.